Today, we're going to talk about 10 paintings that completely blew the art world wide open. These masterpieces didn't just push the boundaries, they triggered full scale artistic revolutions. So let's dive in. The Holy Trinity by Masaccio. Our first stop is 1428, with a fresco called the Holy Trinity by the Italian painter Masaccio. Now, Masaccio's actual name was Tommaso di Ser Giovanni di Guidi. Masaccio was just a nickname, and it's a tricky one to translate. It basically means clumsy Tom, big, rough Tom, or even Tom the Brute. But don't worry, he didn't get this name because he was a mean guy. By all accounts, he was just incredibly absent-minded, completely indifferent to worldly affairs, and a bit awkward. He didn't care about money, clothes, or lifestyle. He lived and breathed art. Fun fact, Masaccio actually had a close friend who was also a painter and, confusingly enough, also named Tommaso. But this Tommaso was polite, refined, and elegant. So, people nicknamed him Masolino, which translates to Little Tom or Graceful Tom. But let's get back to the painting. To understand why Masaccio's work was such a big deal, we need to look at what art looked like before him. For centuries, European art consisted almost entirely of icons and frescoes. And to be honest, they were completely flat. Paintings back then had solid gold or monochrome backgrounds. The figures looked like cardboard cutouts pasted onto a wall, all lined up in a single row. If you wanted to tell which character was in front and which was in the back, your only clue was seeing who was overlapping whom. On top of that, faces on these old icons looked identical and showed zero emotion. But here is the kicker. Size was all about status. In medieval art, the size of a figure depended entirely on their spiritual importance in the Christian hierarchy, not their distance from the viewer. The Virgin Mary, for instance, would often be drawn several times larger than the apostles. It wasn't because she was a giant or standing closer. It was simply because she was more important. Realism was completely hijacked by religious symbolism. Now, there was one exception. About 100 years before Masaccio, a painter named Giotto tried to introduce three-dimensional figures and real human emotions into his work. But he was mostly guessing, doing it purely by intuition. Another fascinating nuance of that era is that many creators of these icons and frescoes didn't even view themselves as artists or creators in the modern sense. They saw themselves as craftsmen, more like modern-day electricians or house painters. They rarely signed their work, which is why the names of most medieval masters are lost to history. A painting was treated as a regular commodity. The church was the buyer. They'd order it, sign a contract, take delivery, pay the bill, and move on. Masaccio changed that. Forever. About 10 years before the Holy Trinity was painted, a brilliant architect named Filippo Brunelleschi conducted the first ever scientific experiment in art history. Brunelleschi stood in front of the Florence Baptistry with a mirror and a wooden panel. He painted the building exactly as he saw it, drilled a tiny peephole in the center of the panel, and discovered something mind-blowing. Every single line, the pavement, the walls, the roof converged at one exact spot through that hole. With this experiment, Brunelleschi discovered and mathematically proved linear perspective, the optical rule that objects appear smaller the further away they are from the viewer. Today, linear perspective seems blindingly obvious to us. But before Brunelleschi, artists literally didn't perceive it, which meant they couldn't paint it. The discovery of linear perspective shook the art world to its core. It meant that on a completely flat surface, you could create the illusion of depth, as if you'd cut a literal hole into a wall. And Masaccio was the very first painter to unleash this discovery at full power. When he painted the Holy Trinity fresco on a flat wall inside the Santa Maria Novella Church in Florence, he didn't just paint characters. He painted a massive, vaulted niche. If you look closely at the ceiling in the fresco, you can see how the lines converge toward the center, creating a stunning 3D effect on a flat surface. That is linear perspective in action. Masaccio meticulously calculated the columns, the arch, and the coffered ceiling receding feet into the background. Inside this deep recess, he placed the crucified Christ, God the Father behind him, Mary and John on the sides, and the patrons who paid for the painting at the entrance. When the fresco was unveiled to the public, it had the effect of a bombshell. Later art historical sources claim that churchgoers flooded in and, unable to believe their eyes, walked right up to the wall to touch it. They genuinely thought a physical alcove had been carved into the stone. People were feeling the painted columns and peeking inside just to make sure it was a flat surface. The fresco became a massive attraction, a mind-bending illusion that crowds flocked to see. While we don't have official documents confirming this exact panic, it's safe to assume that for people of the 15th century, this felt like magic, a violation of the laws of nature. Think about the very first time you experienced high-quality, immersive 3D or VR. That is exactly how those churchgoers felt. Tragically, Masaccio never got to enjoy the full fruits of his fame. He died just a year after finishing this masterpiece, at the young age of 27, under highly mysterious circumstances, with strong rumors suggesting he was poisoned. Yet, in his short life, Masaccio unlocked the gateway for all the legendary geniuses of the Renaissance who followed: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Sandro Botticelli, and many others. For the next 500 years, Western art would be obsessed with a single goal: how to convincingly create a 3D illusion on a 2D surface, making the viewer forget they're looking at nothing but paint on wood or canvas. This illusion of volume became the ultimate gold standard of painting, and it remained that way until the late 19th century, when the Impressionists started the next big revolution. The Holy Trinity is where the Renaissance truly began. And that brings us to our next genius, a man who was ahead of his time by at least a century.